Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to introduce a remarkable personality who has made significant contributions to literature, journalism, and social activism. Please welcome the acclaimed writer, theatre actor, and dedicated activist, Nirmala Govindarajan, for our next session, How Can Stories Heal Our Inner Wounds? Her novels, such as Community Catalyst, Hunger's Daughters, and Taboo, are not just stories. They are a poignant exploration of identity, freedom, and the harsh realities of life. Taboo was shortlisted for many awards, including the Rabindranath Tagore Literary Prize, cementing Nirmala's place as a significant voice in contemporary Indian literature. Nirmala's writing is characterized by its lyrical prose, deep empathy, and unflinching portrayal of social injustices. Her work not only tells compelling stories but also challenges us to reflect on the unseen and unheard lives around us. Today, she'll be presenting a session on how stories can heal our inner wounds. Please join me in welcoming the incredible Nirmala Govindarajan and our own amazing Meera Nair back on stage.
Hello everyone again. How can stories heal our inner wounds? The topic of this session itself is very intriguing. We are here with Ms. Nirmala Govindarajan, a novelist, poet, journalist, and social sector documentarian, and many more. So let's dive into questions because we have some time constraints. So, as a journalist and a social worker, you have worked with a lot of victims of child abuse and child labor, trafficking, and all these difficult subjects. How much of those experiences are reflected or influenced in your work of literature, like novels?
Yeah. Thanks, Meera, and thank you for those lovely questions. And I think you're doing an incredible job as a first-time presenter. So, hats off to you, and thanks, Ala, again. So, coming back to your question, see, I am a very I do what I feel from deep within all the time. Everything I do is just from the very inner core. So unless something shakes me up, I am not able to respond to it. I don't think I'll be able to do a 9-to-5 job just to sustain my living. So I have to do something that I'm really passionate about. Otherwise I lose myself, I lose my path. So my books, the way they came to me was, Hunger's Daughters. My first book happened when I had my friend Catherine, who was working with an NGO called Development Focus, which worked in the Naxal regions, in the deep Naxal pockets of Orissa, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and those regions. I was working with the Times of India. I was a page 3 journalist handling art and literature. And before that, I had done some social sector documentation, but at that time, I was working for mainstream media. And she said, why don't you come and help us document some of the stories, because we need to raise funds. And so I went with her, got on a plane from Bangalore to Bhubaneswar, and got off it. And from there, we got onto a rattly bus and into the deep forests of a land that nobody goes to. You need to be taken there by a social worker. I can't say I'm a journalist because somebody will knock me off instantly. And, there are all kinds of tribals riding the bus. We were in very deep forest lands, and through it all, the bus breaks down in the night, and you can hear some animals in the distance. And we come and we drive through the night, and daybreak is there, and I find myself in this spectacular place called Keonjhar, which is one of the deepest mining pockets of Orissa, because what has happened now in India is that a lot of miners have taken over forest tribal lands, and they have kind of dislodged the tribals from there, and the tribals are having a very tough time given that our government does nothing about nobody, right? None of our politicians have even walked to those regions. Yeah. So if you'd like, I could kind of set a context to that. You know, the first child that I met, no, some of the people I met in these forest regions. I'll just take you through a small excerpt. The soul of the soil is determined by the hands that weed it. Today, Nominta Deburi's mother weeds the paddy fields, her soul lost to the cause. There is no news of her daughter. The child has vanished into the thickness of the forest. The forest is full of secrets which do not have the habit of coming out into the open by choice. Nominta's mother cannot keep her woe a secret. She weeps, she hollers, she spits a curse to the heavens. She wipes her tears. They flow again profusely. She cries, she whimpers, she simpers. The tears flow continuously. Her face is salty, her eyes are red, her heart is weary. She carries on with her day's work. She has 4 mouths to feed back home. Life must go on in Nominta's hutment until the future breadwinner returns home to Manipura. Will Nominta Deburi return home to her mother? Ask Inspector General Bawa. Rest assured that the mastermind behind the Awaken Peacekeeping Mission will not give secrets away, neither by personal will nor by coercion. So this book, Hunger's Daughters, the first that I ever wrote after going into the forests, was based on such voices that I'd seen and heard. It's fictionalized, but this is the reality of what exists. And on the one hand, you have the Naxals, and on the other hand, you have the miners. And in between all of this are caught India's poorest population, where more than they are all 40% of the population is below poverty line, and each of them is half my size. You can see their rib cages. Yeah.
I have no words to, say now. It is heartbreaking. Yeah. So, do you think by telling their stories, these victims' story, are you I think you are trying to heal their wounds? How do you see it?
As Aminata so beautifully spoke in the previous session, the way we relate to some others' wounds is also a lot of what we have gone through. It's how we choose to research it or tell it from a distance is what makes the story, removes the story from us to the other. But there's always, I believe there's always an us in it, because even the way Vijay has sort of narrated it, is his story goes back to his ancestors. And there's something about that draws you to it. And as a child that was growing up, I went through some difficult times because my father had a drinking problem, and I started working when I was 13 years old. I used to give tuitions, and when I went there and I saw this first child, Sushanti Bodra, over there in this village called Bochagora, her mother had left home and her father had been long dead. And that day, her mother had left home, but we had gone to visit her, and this child hadn't come to the village school. And we waited for 2-3 hours, and then somebody told us that her mom has just left home and she's alone, this child. We trudged down that little village path, mud path. There are just hutments on either side. And I saw this flash of pink darting into the house, and a series of a few ducks and 2 sheep following her. And as I went there, I saw this little child, 12 years old, looking so lost. And then I just went, and I couldn't help it. I just took her into my arms. And that's it. That child opened up, and there I was face to face with one of the youngest breadwinners of Orissa. She was rearing ducks for a living. She had 3,000 rupees in her bank account, and she was training all the other kids to live that way, because this NGO had a program called Earn While You Learn, and to be proud of what you do. And the children were also going to school and helping each other. So that was so heartwarming.
So, working with them, these vulnerable lives, is it emotionally taxing for you? Are you also trying to heal by your stories?
Certainly, for me, like I said, whatever I do is a healing process. Be it yoga, be it writing, be it the way I talk to somebody, be it where I go. I think my entire life is a conscious process to live better than yesterday or to live it up today. So, while it heals us, it is also an attempt to help the world heal. You know, place a mirror there and say, look into this mirror and see what's happening on the other side. We are living our happy lives in the city or far away in some other country, but in our own backyards, there's all of this going on and nobody's taking notice of it. And in India, trust me, nobody takes notice of it. There are a few small non-governmental organizations that are doing this work. No politician has entered any of these villages. The mining mafia does. And I'll tell you, on one of my visits to Orissa, I was in this small dingy hotel in this place called Saunpur. And it's very dangerous because in India, as it is, women have to be very careful wherever they wander, but especially in these regions, it's even worse. And I was told not to go to the dining area to eat and to call my food into the room, but I did have to go there to place my order, and I overheard a gentleman. He was sitting there, he had diamond rings on all his fingers, and he was talking to somebody, a local guy, and they were discussing in Telugu how he wants to buy a 3-year-old girl child for trafficking. He would traffic the child, he would use her as a slave at home. So these parents, these people in Orissa and Jharkhand live in such acute poverty because when they are called to work in brick kilns, and you know the whole family goes away, and then they can't take all the children sometimes, and the girls are a burden. In India, girls are considered a burden because they are not going to perpetuate the family name, they're going to go away to somebody else's house, and the father has to spend on her marriage and whatnot. So it is really heart-wrenching that these children are being sold off by their own parents sometimes.
Your novel Taboo was shortlisted for Rabindranath Tagore Literary Prize. That book also talks about underage trafficking and the strength of the survivors in India. How was the process of writing that book, and can you tell more about the premises, maybe?
Yeah. So interestingly, my friend Catherine, she moved to another NGO. It's called Freedom Firm, that rescues and rehabilitates underage girls who are kidnapped and trafficked. And so I had gone to Calcutta one time. I went to Ooty, where they have their head office, where they kind of rehabilitate these girls. But in Calcutta, they have a workshop where the girls are taught to make fashion jewelry. This is made by the girls of Ruhama Design. That's available online. So y'all I will pass on the link to y'all, but it's available in the United States as well. So it's made by them, and you'll find the names of the girls at the back of the pouch, who made it, which survivor made it. So there was this one girl I'll call her Sagarika, I'll just change her name. So she was about 21, and she said, Didi, that means big sister, I have, please come for my wedding if you're here, I'm getting married. I said, wow, you're getting married. She was the workshop manager. She had been rescued. But her story was that when she was just 8 years old, her sister and brother-in-law sold her off to a brothel. Okay? And when she arrived at that brothel, she didn't know where she was. She was just 8. She hadn't even attained her puberty. And the pimp over there told her she has to see her first customer. Okay? And this child wasn't ready. And there was a lady there in her 40s. She said, I will take care of you. The pimp overheard that and stabbed that woman to death in front of the child. These kids see the worst. And ever since, she had to start sleeping with men, with clients, from that moment on. And this girl, and of course they go to these tier 2 cities, they're found at, and they're rescued. Somebody leaves a clue. And it's a whole process of rescuing. You have to have a citizen, a common citizen to step in. You'll have the government, you'll have the welfare association, you'll have the police staff and the rescue team on the entire operation. It's not easy to kind of do it. So when they rescued the child, they discovered that she had had, by the age of 12, she had had 12 customers by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Imagine what happens to that child's body. And after she's rescued, they find that these kids are so sexually active because that's all they've known, and they have to undergo horse therapy and a whole lot of other kinds of therapy to kind of get them back, get them out of that. And also it's easy money. So by the time they're rescued, they're over 18. They can go back to trade, but in India, prostitution is illegal, right? So that's what kind of inspired me, and these were the kind of stories that were looking me in the eye. But I also saw within it, while my stories may be bleak and they may sound macabre, they always have a light at the end of the tunnel, and the girl is always the winner. And I also saw that, in telling the story of Erendera, she's my protagonist in Taboo, that she is this woman who's, quite confident of her own sexuality, of who she is, and she also goes on to have the ability to love. Would you like to hear a small excerpt? Then that's it. This is just the setting scene. Okay. Perumal Arokya Swami is well versed in the art of holding slender beedis between his lips. He tightly drags the native tobacco from the spine of the indigenous Indian cigarette. The government-endorsed original Vignesh Beedi of unadulterated intoxication is Perumal Arokya Swami's forever favorite brand. As a lone star from the far east shimmers with a vengeance in the sky, Perumal Arokya Swami drags the beedi one more time. He is beholden to this native intoxication. He swerves his matted head to face his companion for the night. Moving close to meet her mouth, Perumal Arokya Swami deftly passes the intoxication from his own blackened teeth unto a pair of lipstick-red instruments of kiss. The native flavor grabs his companion in her feminine core. This singular Vignesh Beedi is fortunate. It now rests between a pair of delicious red lips. These lips must have an owner who cares to paint them this alluring shade of red each time the sun goes to bed. The lady with the slender hands wears red. This alluring hue is brightest upon her lips. Her lips, those sumptuous instruments of kiss, are a feast for her lover with the matted head. But the lady is not alone with her lover upon this rain-blessed night. The man with blackened teeth and the lady with the red lips have the rain for company, all right. Rain, rain, podade, groans Perumal Arokya Swami in the Tamil tongue. Rain, rain, get lost, you rascal. But the rain persists. It brings the lady and her companion close, skin to skin. Rain, rain, come back, you rascal. Rain, rain, vadade, groans Perumal Arokya Swami in the native tongue of Cotton Pettai. Okay, so this is the setting. They are on a footpath I've called it Cotton Pettai, but it is Coimbatore, where the setting is happening, where Perumal Arokya Swami is homeless, and this lady with the slender hands is a prostitute. But she has found her lover there, and also this was to bring out the aspect that she also has the ability to love and to have a real lover, although she is a prostitute.
That is, I don't know if it is right to say that is beautiful, because it is all this conversation is little heartbreaking for me, hearing about it, and I can't imagine how you do it as social work, and how a lot of wonderful people are working behind NGOs and bringing helping these victims. Thank you so much for your work. And okay, let's lighten the mood a little bit. So I've read that your stories, your writing style is little like poetic and lyrical prose. Is that your favorite way of writing? You know, your writing style is that?
So that's the style that comes to me naturally. So which is why I write that way. And also it gives me the leeway to sort of transit worlds, enter into magic realism, into spaces that don't exist, into realms, into planets, into regions. It can take me anywhere. It can take the reader anywhere and to paint that picture. So that's the whole liberty that fiction gives you, and to do it your way and to kind of intersperse it. And I'm so happy, I'm glad, because it's also difficult to find a publisher for such kind of literary fiction, but I've been fortunate so far for the first 2 books. I'm waiting to see what happens to the rest. Yeah.
Can we expect a collection of poems from you? You haven't published any poems, right?
So whereas the books have poems in between and I have poetry in all my books, now people have been asking me for a book of poems, which I'm sort of putting together. So hopefully sometime soon.
Looking forward
along
to it.
Thanks.
Your book, Community Catalyst, it talked about a young IAS officer emerged from a rural part of Rajasthan. Was there a fictional part of it, or yeah, it was a fiction?
So the Community Catalyst is recommended reading for civil services aspirants in India. So this book was commissioned by Sapna Book House, and the editor at Sapna called me and said, Nirmala, will you do this book? Because it's inspired. There is this civil service, there is this IAS officer. He's with the education department and he's just about to retire. His name is Bharatlal Meena. And he comes from a small town in Rajasthan. And he's been serving the Karnataka cadre. Now, for those who don't know, in India, when you are in the civil services, you can only serve within your own state. But in the year that Bharatlal Meena did his civil services exam, they were posted to states outside of their own state. So, whereas the book is based on his true life and I researched deeply, I've also sort of written it in a dramatized fiction format so that it's easy to consume. A story is always easier consumed which I will tell you, when you're trying to bring the, non-fiction to the fiction platform, then people relate to it more easily. But then, of course, it's very, very factual because I couldn't deviate. It's got to do with the civil service, with an IAS officer, and it's also got to do with so many politicians whose names appear in the book and the incidents and the setting and all of that. But he's an incredible man himself because he belonged to the Meena tribe again, a very small tribal community, a large tribal community in Rajasthan, but he belonged to a small tribal village called Sawai Madhavpur, which is close to the Ranthambore forest area. And I grew up under very, very difficult circumstances. And when he was posted to the Karnataka cadre, he started a movement called Apna Desh. He learnt the Kannada language impeccably, speaks impeccably today. He's a Rajasthani. And he motivated the people of, there is this arid region in northern Karnataka where where the water is very brackish. You don't even get drinking water. There again, poverty is very high. It's on the Hyderabad-Karnataka border, and you also have Maharashtra on the other side. And his policy, his thing was that, you meet democracy halfway. It doesn't matter what the government is doing. So just walk towards it. And the people started a movement, and they collected enough money, and they set up the local tank where they are able to get good drinking water. Until date, years after he moved out of Lingsugur, Sannur, it's called Meena Kere. They've named it Meena Lake after him. And the people still speak so highly of him. So he didn't go with me to all these places. I just gathered all the inputs and I went by myself, and there was so much good being told about him, and I think it's a very good example for future civil services aspirants in India. And actually, if the civil services, if the IAS officers work well, India would be a better country. But they're all in the pockets of some politician, and you know how it works. You know how India works or doesn't work.
You co-authored the book Mind Blogs 1.0. It was your idea. It was the first of its kind, that the blog to book kind of art form. How did you conceptualize it?
Yeah, so I think this was way back in 2005. We had all just started working, and I had a lot of little. There weren't really blogs; were just beginning to happen. But then they were all. We had been writing a lot of first persons for the newspaper, and there had been poems and little musings on life. About those little things that make life so livable, and so important. It could be a raindrop, it could be anything that people are not looking at. We all want the big things. So now to inspire future generations to sort of look at those aspects and to feel happy about it, about the everydayness and the everything, about the leaf on the tree or whatever, So, but they're very anecdotal pieces. And I had a few, and I said I wanted to bring out this book. And then I said, why not call some of my friends, invite some of my friends to co-author this work, because there are so many different perspectives that are beautiful. So I invited my friend Christina Daniels and Zahid Javali to do the book with me, and we brought it out. We brought it out via Zahid's small publishing company called Right Wing Media. And, the day we were going to launch it, there was some riots happening, and it was also Gandhi Jayanti, and they said, y'all are not going to be able to do this. And then I said, no, it will happen, don't worry, things will clear out tomorrow. And said, where are the guests and whatever? I don't know, I have this weird way of pulling things off last minute. And finally, when we did have the launch on October 2nd, and there was a belong to Hindu family, Muslim family, Christian family. I don't align with any religion. I'm irreligious, but at that time, and then we launched it on October 2nd, and then we had some 300 people who just made it there. So it was great fun. And we've invited guest authors to write it, and we want to bring out a 2 and 3 and whatever as time goes by.
Did it happen? The next...
We will. It hasn't yet happened, but now that you've reminded me, we will.
Also, you conduct a lot of writing and reading workshops. I love the name Writing Yatra, Reading Yatra. And how much do you enjoy doing the workshops?
So, Writer's Yatra really was... So, I'm a gypsy, so I've been traveling a lot, and I go to Rishikesh, I go everywhere, and I stay in these hostels, travelers' hostels, where I meet a lot of interesting people. And one time, a few years ago, just before COVID, when I was traveling in Rishikesh, I met many people who wanted to write. And then I went back there, and they said, why not? And then I said, so they were asking me, how do you write? I said, I use my sensory perceptions to write, And then I came up with this idea on how to use your sensory perceptions to write. On each day, we went on a sensorial journey, be it tasting the food on one day, or going on a hike another day, and bringing all these elements together. So and I had that's how it kind of evolved and grew. And I worked with different people. It was not about how to write; it was how you internalize your own everything around you to sort of write what you feel like, write in whatever language you feel like. And that was good fun, and that's how it's sort of grown. So I had people someone from England, someone from the United States, someone from India, someone from Peru. So it was great fun because you meet diverse travelers along these journeys.
That would have been a very interesting
experience. And that's how I've been sort of growing it over the years.
Oh, I actually had a question regarding this co-authoring thing. Regarding co-authoring a book. Yeah. How is it like you choose a co-author? Is it like you have to align with that person, right? How did that happen? I know you have co-authored another book also, The Trailblazers of Bangalore.
Oh yeah, no, okay. So The Trailblazers of Bangalore was a Times of India publication. So they called different people to write for it. So I didn't have to collaborate with the authors. But with Mind Blogs, of course, when I chose to invite people to co-author it with me, they had similar sensibilities. So you need to be on the same page, otherwise you're going to be all over the place. And especially when you want to put out thoughts that, diverse thoughts to trigger change, then it's always interesting to have voices that are in conjunction with you, otherwise it'll be going all over the place. So it's important to be on the same page, otherwise it's not going to work.
So, writing, journalism, documentarian, and poet, and you do yoga retreats and writing workshop, curator of art and literature festivals. Which is your favorite work? I know it is hard to choose, but yeah.
Actually, I like doing everything because they're all interrelated in a certain way. So how I do my yoga retreats is I have yoga plus writing. And so I just integrate whatever I have. And piecing a festival together is great fun because when I first did the Times of India Literary Carnival, we did it slightly differently. We had Shakespeare with an Indian tadka. I got people, youngsters to sort of, contextualize Shakespeare in the Indian context, or at least wear Indian outfits and do small little bits of it. And then we had a bard's corner where there was this gentleman sitting there and putting all your words to song and singing, which you'll find in a lot of London streets. It was a beautiful experience because people would go there, write something, and he would set it to tune. And then we also ran a contest called New Voices in the New Age, where I invited a lot of students from different colleges to write, and then based on that theme, and then all the best works went into a book, and the best works won awards. So, and then of course there were the authors and the interactions, but aside from that, there were all these allied activities that made it even more exciting and interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, now we can take some questions from the audience.
Thank you for a good session. My name is Shah. So my question is that I really appreciate your hard work and your all your efforts to uplift the society and the people who are not served properly. So my question, apart from this writing, physical books. So physical books are inspirational. It's good to get have a good vocabulary to build our literature. But in order to make a paradigm shift, I think in my perspective, it's good to focus on social media, so maybe advanced one, where you can make what you call like a reels, which is 30 seconds or 1 minute, where you put your catchy phrase or something which could eventually, to get to the next level. So do you do anything like that, or what is your opinion on that, to bring more attention of your work to the newer generation it's not about newer generation, even the people everyone nowadays are on social media. So do you do that, and what do you think about that? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm not a very tech-savvy person, so I do put up some stuff in social media because when you sign on a book, the publishers first ask you whether we have social media presence. So we are expected to put stuff out on social media. But I've had a very interesting journey. So when I first started writing Hunger's Daughters, there were these students of communicative English from Mount Carmel College, Bangalore, but interning in Times of India. And I would sit and write every day, and every day they'd keep reading what I wrote. And they'd say, come on, what's happening next? What's happening next? So I just kept flowing with it, and at the end of 40 or 50 days, when I'd completed the entire book, I was looking into the faces of two young bright spark girls who had set out to, work in the corporate sector. But at the end of those 40 or 50 days, they said, we are working for the social sector. They went on to finish their education, and they joined social sector organizations. And they're working directly with people. So this is what, I think it's those tiny drops. And you spread the light through one person, you shine the light, and that person's going to influence 10 other people. And that's what I strive to do. And I think that's what we all should strive to do. We are all looking at the very big picture. But, when you actually go and look at the work of an NGO, especially the small NGOs in the far-flung regions of India's forest hamlets, you'll find that it's very difficult to actually see that change. It's going to take years for that change to become visible to you. So you start training a child to rear ducks. It's going to take them a whole year to learn the process. And then they go on to nurture some more children after them. So you've just gone and enabled one child to do it, and that child's enabled one, and one. That's how it spreads. So that's the beauty of what we do from our hearts. And that's how I think it should be done, because in this whole social media era, we are just losing out that personal touch, and we are actually not, I don't even know whether we're impacting any life by just putting out stuff out there. But it's also important, having said that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nirmala, for this wonderful session, sharing your experiences. And thank you so much for everything you do. And look forward to reading your book. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
All the best for your all the future work.
Thank you. And thanks for curating it so well. Lovely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, beautiful ladies, for that wonderful session. Some life experiences are so traumatizing and so difficult, very different from ours, and are still invaluable in shaping our understanding, empathy, and resilience. We have so much to learn from such stories. Being aware of such stories helps us foster empathy and connection, allowing readers and listeners to understand and connect with others' experiences, thereby reducing our own feelings of isolation. Ladies and gentlemen, what an enriching session we have just experienced with the wonderful Nirmala Govindarajan. Nirmala explored the profound and transformative power of storytelling and illuminated how sharing personal narratives helps individuals process trauma, find solace, and ultimately heal emotional and psychological wounds. Nirmala offered us a compassionate understanding of the remarkable impact storytelling can have on the human spirit. Let's give another round of applause to Nirmala for such a heartfelt session. And thank you so much, Meera, for providing us with this enlightening experience. Thank you. We hope you have all found this discussion as insightful and inspiring as we have. Now it's time to take a well-deserved break. Lunch, which is our Kerala specialty podichor, will be served in the main dining area. We have both vegetarian and non-vegetarian options. We encourage you to take this opportunity to reflect on the session, discuss it with fellow attendees, and enjoy some delicious food. We'll reconvene at 1:10 p.m. for our next exciting sessions. Thank you and enjoy your lunch.